and that's why we're here today. As Commander-in-Chief, I have no greater responsibility than the security of the American people and the well-being of our courageous men and women in uniform and their families. Over the past 2 years, my administration has done whatever it takes to meet these responsibilities. We've been relentless against al-Qaeda and its affiliates, preventing terrorist attacks and saving lives. We brought nearly 100,000 troops out of Iraq in an orderly way. We ended our combat mission, and we refocused on Afghanistan, where we're breaking the Taliban's momentum and training Afghan forces. And from Europe to Asia, we've strengthened old alliances, forged new partnerships, and restored American leadership in the world. Still, we confront urgent challenges. In Iraq, we're working to bring the rest of our troops home as Iraqis secure their democracy. In Afghanistan, we're moving into a new phase, transferring responsibility for security to Afghan forces, starting to reduce American forces this summer, and building a long-term partnership with the Afghan people. As people across the Middle East and North Africa seek to determine their own destiny, we must ensure that America stands with those who seek their universal rights. And that includes continuing to support the international effort to protect the Libyan people. And here at home, as we make the hard decisions that are needed to reduce America's debt, we cannot compromise our ability to defend our nation or our interests around the world. These are some of the pressing challenges that we must meet in the pivotal days ahead. And today I am proud to announce key members of my national security team who, along with Vice President Biden and Secretary Clinton, will help us meet them. I've worked closely with most of the individuals on this stage, and all of them have my complete confidence. They are leaders of enormous integrity and talent who've devoted their lives to keeping our nation strong and secure. And I am personally very, very grateful to each of them for accepting these new assignments. Given the pivotal period that we're entering, I felt that it was absolutely critical that we had this team in place so that we can stay focused on our missions. I am confident Bob Gates will be remembered as one of the finest defense secretaries in American history, and I will always be grateful for his service. I'm equally confident that Bob's reform agenda will be carried out by another great public servant of our time, Leon Panetta. Leon appreciates the struggles and sacrifices of our troops and military families because he served in the Army himself, and because he and his wife Sylvia are proud parents of a son who served in Afghanistan. And just as Leon earned the trust and respect of our intelligence professionals at the CIA by listening to them and fighting fiercely on their behalf, I know he'll do the same for our armed forces and their families. The patriotism and extraordinary management skills that have defined Leon's 4 decades of service is exactly what we need in our next Secretary of Defense. As a former congressman and White House Chief of Staff, Leon knows how to lead, which is why he is held in such high esteem not only in this city but around the world. As a CIA director who's played a decisive role in our fight against violent extremism, he understands that even as we begin the transition in Afghanistan, we must remain unwavering in our fight against al-Qaeda. And as a former OMB director, he'll ensure that even as we make tough budget decisions, we'll maintain our military superiority and keep our military the very best in the world. Leon, I know that you've been looking forward to returning home to Sylvia and your beautiful Monterey. So I thank you for taking on yet another assignment for our country, and I hope you don't have a clock. I'm also very pleased that Leon's work at the CIA will be carried on by one of our leading strategic thinkers and one of the finest military officers of our time, General David Patraeus. This is the second time in a year that I've asked General Patraeus to take on a demanding assignment. And I know this one carries a special sacrifice for him and his wife, Holly. After nearly 40 years in uniform, including leading American and coalition forces in some of the most challenging military missions since 9/11, David Patraeus will retire from the Army that he loves to become the next CIA director.
All right, let's move over to the musical chairs. You have written extensively about the constitutional violations that have been perpetrated in this country in the name of our national defense going back a decade. Among the criticisms that have been out there was the decision to put a military commander in charge of the CIA under the Bush administration. And the Democrats at that time, and you were just describing this to me at the commercial, up in arms, outrageous. We can't have a militarized CIA. One of the most vocal critics is the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Dianne Feinstein. Now we find the Democrats with Dianne Feinstein at the Senate Intelligence Committee and Barack Obama in the White House putting yet another general in charge of the Central Intelligence Agency.
Well, the list of policies that the Democrats vehemently objected to during the Bush years, but which they now embrace and justify and support as their own, is almost endless. You could spend hours and hours and hours on television listing and describing them all. This is yet another one. Not only did Dianne Feinstein say it was dangerous to have a four-star general running the CIA, Joe Biden said that it would mean that the CIA would get, quote, gobbled up by the Defense Department. The idea always was that the CIA would provide a bureaucratic check against the military, which always is pro-war and drives to where that they're supposed to provide independent analysis. And yet here you have the commander and chief advocate of not only the public war in Afghanistan, but the covert war in Pakistan, now in charge of the intelligence that the president will receive as to what policies ought to be continued. The Democrats were right when they argued that Bush was doing something improper by appointing General Hayden to run the CIA, and those same arguments should be made now with regard to General Petraeus' appointment to the CIA.
At the same time, we've watched the president go into Libya without ever even acknowledging Congress's existence. George Bush, at the very least, paid lip service to the need to at least spend half a morning with the U.S. Congress. Is it as bad as it looks? Again, I don't feel like I know all the information sometimes when I look at the ins and outs of American defense policy. I know that I don't, but I know that I am watching some of the major intersections, and the trend seems to be a bad one.
Well, one of the clear purposes of putting General Petraeus at the CIA is that wars are now fought out of the CIA. They don't just engage intelligence to support wars, they act operationally as part of the war. That's always been true. They've overthrown governments and they've done things along those lines, but now things like the drone program, for example, which is the leading weapon used in our war in Yemen, our war in Pakistan, our war in Libya, is run through the CIA. And so what this does is it lets President Obama run our secret wars that are already covert anyway, and do so with almost no accountability by putting the war commander, General Petraeus, at the CIA, which is entirely immunized from oversight and certainly from public accountability. And what you see is with, for example, starting of the war in Libya without congressional authorization and barely any democratic debate, and these wars that most Americans don't even know are taking place in a variety of countries, is this growing militarization of the entire national security state, the CIA, and removing it from the apparatuses of democratic accountability.
And then very quickly, again, for the longest time, the Democratic Party was seen as the party of resistance, advocating many of the policies that you just described. It's clear that the GOP, with the exception of perhaps Ron Paul and that faction of the Republican Party, there appears to be no one in the two-party political system that is advocating for basic democratic principles. Is that fair?
Well, it used to, as you say, before Barack Obama was nominated, these were partisan disputes. People on the right supported them, people on the left opposed them. Now that they're Obama's policies as well, they've become bipartisan consensus. They're barely debated anymore, and the objections that Democrats recently had have eroded away.
Back in 1947, an anonymous Foreign Service officer published an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs. Published it under the name Mr. X. He did not want to use his real name because he did not want to jeopardize his gig in the diplomatic corps, but he wanted to make an argument for what he called firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies, or as the fundamental national security strategy of the Cold War would come to be known, containment. The Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars at Washington, D.C. Just published what they are essentially billing as the follow-up to Mr. X 64 years later. The author of this piece is in reality two guys, two officers, a Marine officer and a Navy officer. But in the paper, they are bylined as Mr. Y. Their case for what ought to be the new big idea animating all of American national security thinking now is that we need international strength and influence that doesn't rely completely on a giant and frankly overused expensive military. Joining us now for the interview is a man who's done more than anybody else in the last decade to articulate that the same type of big rethinking of American power. He is Andrew Bacewich. His latest book is called Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War. It's now out in paperback. He's a professor of international relations and history at Boston University. Professor Bacewich, thanks very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
How important is the Mr. Y idea and a publication of this time and of this type at this time?
That was a nice setup. And it was a nice setup because I think you really were putting your finger on the big problem, that the rearranging of the deck chairs, exchange of people who we don't think of people who have ideas, Panetta, Patraeus, I think is indicative of the absence of strategic thinking in the Capitol for the last 10 years, which brings us to Mr. Y. I think the Mr. Y essay is of interest less because of the content, more because of who wrote it. This Navy captain, Marine Corps colonel, and what they're essentially saying is our approach to national security policy has been excessively militarized. We should focus on engagement rather than effort to control or dominate the world. And I think of particular significance, they say, we really need to pay more attention to what happens inside the country. They use this phrase, sustainable prosperity. In other words, prosperity is not simply what the profits your company made over the last quarter. Prosperity needs to be something that looks to the long term, and sustainable prosperity means that the country should be diverting some of its resources from the Department of Defense to building infrastructure, developing an educated citizenry. Now, I think what's important here is that it's coming from two serving military officers. Many people, I think, might believe that proponents of change in the realm of national security might think that the officer corps is likely to be a place that's resistant to change. And these guys, I think, help us understand that the officer corps may well be a constituency supportive of change. And what I'd tell you is, it ain't just these two guys. One of the things that's really impressed me since my last book came out is the tremendous number of emails that I've been getting from serving officers, not of my acquaintance, who are basically saying, you're right, things are screwed up, we need to take a different approach. I'm not getting emails from 3- and 4-star generals. Actually, it's better. I'm getting emails from the captains and the majors and lieutenant colonels, meaning the coming generation of military leadership. And that really gives me hope that if we could have a serious debate about national security in this country, we may actually find that members of the officer corps are supportive of change that will be in the interest of the country as a whole.
Do you think it's likely that we could have that debate? Do you see a political, I mean, you're a keen political observer as well as a keen military observer. Do you see us as moving toward having a real discussion about that?
Well, the officer corps is not going to trigger that debate. I mean, the debate has to come from our civilian leadership. And there I wouldn't say I despair, but I come close to despair because, to put it bluntly, it seems to me that civilian leaders in the Democratic Party, that has to be where the impetus for change comes from in this regard, have not demonstrated the necessary moral courage to take the sort of political risks that would be required to say, we've gone down the wrong path. We are not going to dominate the world with American military power. We are going to bankrupt the country. We are going to squander whatever moral standing we have. And therefore, there needs to be an honest and nonpartisan debate about what alternatives may be. I think Mr. Y has given us some suggestive thoughts about what those alternatives could be, but it's got to come from our political leadership.